I know that you all are excited for a wonderful conversation today, as am I. And we're going to keep welcoming people as the time moves, but I want to make sure these folks get all of the time that we have allotted. So I'm going to jump in. Welcome for just joining us for this last virtual session of this week. And thank you for joining us for the virtual sessions, the 5th virtual session series that we've done. We've had over 1,500 people register today alone. We've had, I think, 218, I think I heard, register for this one. So we are excited about this conversation. So the purpose of our time together is to really share information, ask questions, share thoughts and best practices around the topic that we're talking about today. We really want you to reimagine how to deliver engaging leadership programs to students through virtual programs, but then also just, transform your own leadership practice. And so want to spend some time giving you some information about how to use the platform. Please post your comments and questions in the chat area. And Abby, who is holding the tech side, who is holding the front end side, will be scanning that a lot to try to keep up with the questions that come in, the comments that come in. We will use some polls during our time together just to keep you also engaged that way. And so we invite you to respond, and they will appear on the screen when it's time for you to respond. If you have a question for the moderator or the moderators in this case that you do not want to share publicly, we invite you to send them a private message in the chat, or you can send it to me and I can get it to them. We're not going to allow for folks to come off of the microphone, so we won't be doing questions verbally, but we will do our best to try to keep up with the chat and get your questions in. I will say for myself, if you put a Q and colon and then ask your question, I will find those so much easier in the chat. And so I recommend that. Before we really dive in, I want to give a moment for us to acknowledge the land that we're on. And LeaderShape really wants to commit to a practice of acknowledging the land. Go back one slide, Abby. I think you bumped past it. Yep, there we go. We want to acknowledge that the land that each of us is on today is the original homelands of indigenous and tribal nations. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from these territories and lands, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land. Please honor and acknowledge the Native and indigenous populations and people based and have histories on the land that you're on right now. If you don't know that, there are lots of resources online that will allow you to go and find that information, and from that place, really dig into and understand what populations are still on the land and what was the history of the genocide and removal for the peoples that are indigenous to that space. I am on the land of the Lenape in New York City. I'm standing in Brooklyn, New York right now, and think it's just an important practice and understanding that we get to frame all of our work in. There's a history, there is a connection to oppression. And so in talking about social class and our really inability to talk about social class really goes back to that history as well. So I invite you to do that today. So at LeaderShape, our vision is a just, caring, and thriving world where we all lead with integrity and have a healthy disregard for the impossible. And then our mission is to transform the world by increasing the number of people who lead with integrity and have a healthy disregard for the impossible. If you're not familiar with LeaderShape's programming, I'll talk a little bit about it at the end, but invite you into the website to really check that out. Thanks, Nick, for putting that resource in for indigenous, finding the indigenous population or the people that are indigenous to the populations on the land that you're on. All you have to do is type in your zip code and it'll pop up and you can start your exploration there. So I get to introduce these fabulous folks who are with us today. And we have with us Dr. Becky Martinez of Infinity Martinez Consulting and Dr. Sanja Ardouin, I think I got it right, Sanja, from Appalachian State University. And I'm Dr. Tanya Williams, and I am a staff member at LeaderShape. So they've graciously agreed to facilitate the conversation, and they have so much information that we're excited to dig into. Becky and Sanja's full bios are listed in the description of the presentation, but I'll ask them both now to say hello and introduce themselves.
Awesome. Welcome, welcome. Thank you, Tanya, for the introduction. And you're not just a staff member at LeaderShape. Also brilliance. So excited to be here. Dr. Becky Martinez, she, her, and hers. I join you from the Cahuilla and Luiseño indigenous lands here in Southern California. And I'm so excited. We could actually just, the three of us, have a conversation around class and social class and leadership and what that means. And we will have some concepts and polling questions. And we really want you to engage, use the chat, share stories, reflections, questions. I identify as a straddler, so class straddler in this world of academia, and go back to mom and dad and family that aren't formally educated, but are still professionals. And that means I'm in this navigation space often. There's more that you'll get to know about me. And I am here with my very good friend and colleague, Sanja.
Thank you, Dr. Martinez. Hi, y'all. My name is Sanja. I use she, her pronouns. I get the pleasure of being a scholar practitioner in higher education. That's how I would sort of define my work in the field. And I am a person who is from Louisiana, and that is near and dear to my heart, from a rural working class community. I'm a first generation college student. So I care about studying social class because of the lived experiences I have had, sort of navigating the tension between social class and higher ed. And so as Becky mentioned, I identify also as a class straddler in that some of my ways of being are still maintained to my roots of being a working class person, growing up in a working class community. And I also have taken on some values and ways of being of other social classes. So we're excited to be here with you today and be in conversation about social class generally, and also what this means particularly for sort of leadership learning on our campuses.
Thank you, Becky and Sanja. And why don't we just dive in with our first poll to really just get us kicked off.
Wonderful. That sounds great. And even as you all are in this like answering of polling questions, we want you to just kind of get into your body to be clear, right? To feel where class resides in you and how and what that means. So this first poll, right? What is your first association with social class? And we know that polls are restrictive because there could be some different entry points, and ask you to take this in of money and finances, right? Oh, home ownership. That's when I noticed whether I had that home ownership or not, you know, as I grew up. Healthcare and other benefits, right? I know that we bartered a little bit in my family around some healthcare and work education level, right? And so your families or yours or in your neighborhood, right? You being at school, work occupation, so what people do, right? And and clothes and shoes, because that is a huge part of class. So just want to spend a little bit of time seeing where folks are at. What's your first association with social class? And Sanjan, as we look at that, we see money and finances, which is often where folks go, and that's
Yeah.
what their entry point is, at least in a conscious space, right? Yeah.
Becky, can you say more about that in a
Mm.
conscious space? Because I think that that is a key.
Yeah, right. And so that is, what we notice, who has what what you in its conscious, because you can see it. It's the tangible piece of class, right? It is not around language, right, or ways we show up or values. Those sometimes can be unconscious ways of navigating class, and so those conscious ways are often the tangible. Right, that's what we know, what we can see when we're little. We don't notice the language that our families are using,
Mhm.
right? Or the values that they have, right? We haven't maybe even noticed what kind of shoes they wear, right? But we do know, do I have, is there government assistance, right? Do I get the free lunch? What is the structure that I live look like? Um, what do I wear? So the consciousness of that. It's a great question.
I'll add to what you're saying too, Becky, is that from the leadership space, I think we often think about money and finances first as part of social class because we make the assumption that money means power, means leadership. And so how do we also sort of detangle some of those things? Because we know there are lots of people who are leading in lots of different ways. And so that's a very narrow view of leadership, is to assume that those three things have to sort of be together in the practice of leadership, or who we bestow like the title of leader upon.
Yeah. And that's still how we talk about social class in academia. Right. And so it's this conscious piece of, how it's present in our office, and, what leadership is and what our value is around that. So we're going to close out this poll, right? And we're going to present to you some pieces that we've come to know, right, as we think about social class identity and our own experience in research. And Abby, I think that there's another section of this slide that should show up. Awesome. So we have these different forms of capital, and so social class, as you can see, so much more than money. Financial, that's what we've talked about, right? It is what we own. It's how much money you have in your bank. It is your assets, your retirement. And for some people, it's like, I don't even know. I don't know what that is. Right? I still get confused on my retirement package as a consultant talking with the person that does my investing. Right? That's some class stuff right there. Right? Then you have cultural capital, and that's information. Right? And so that's the stuff that you know. It's the information that you know. It's the systems that you can work. It is knowing about certain spaces. And there's also then social capital, right? And that's who we know. Right? That's who we know. That's how Sanja and I ended up here. Right? We are part of LeaderShape. We also know Tanya. We also know Vernon, who's a participant out there. And so the ask, and so this social capital of networking, of mentoring, of connection. Then linguistic capital is how we talk, right? And so whether that is accent, right? Whether that is profanity, because I love to say bullshit every so often. And is that professional or not professional? Where can we say that? When can't we say that? Who can we say that with? And then academic capital, as we think about degrees, right? Especially for most folks that are holding space across the screen, right? Degrees, where from, how many, what in, and then we know that there's more capital to be talked about and be found. And so we want to, this other side of the column has some examples. So talked about some as we think about income and SES. Right? And for us, that's not an antiquated way of it, but it's just a piece of the puzzle, especially in academia, because that's what we pay attention to when we talk about social class, whether it be around financial aid, right, Pell Grant eligible. And so the language that's used out there to talk about class is in that money space, so the financial capital. Then we also have clothing and dress style, particularly shoes. And so, I mean, I even thought about what am I going to wear today? I don't want to wear a blazer, but I don't know if I can show my tattoos. Can I wear a short sleeve? Is that professional stuff, right? Enough. So clothing and style of dress. And then shoes, as we think about, so what kind of shoes do I wear to work when I'm traveling? Right? Are they open toe shoes, closed toe shoes? Are they shoes that construction workers or ranch workers use? Like my family owns some property, like it's called the ranch. And so I have my work shoes. And they are dirty and they are muddy and they can get wet. And so what kind of shoes? Teeth and other forms of healthcare. And so we know that some people may have health insurance to take care of medical stuff, but there's so much around dental, particularly because we can see it. And so what's shown, what are our perceptions, what are our assumptions about who can afford teeth? When you shower, right? Do you shower in the, do you shower in the morning as you get ready for work? Or do you shower at the end of the day because you have been sweating and you're dirty and you want to be clean, right? And so even when we shower is a piece of class. Again, experience travel, music, museums, like where have you gone? What do you listen to? What do you watch? What do you eat? And where do you eat it, right? And so even, are you eating it in a break room or in your car? I have a friend the other day who works at Lululemon who sent me a picture, and it was her lunch break. She lives up north in Northern California, and she was sitting on a bench because their break room is closed, and that was her other option. And she's like, and I don't have a car right now to go sit in for my break. Right. And so where do people eat? And then what do we eat? And there's a race class around that. How do we bring it in Tupperware? Right? How do we warm it up? Do we go out every day for lunch? All of those pieces. And who you know and who knows you. We talked about that. We talked about language, accents, word choice, profanity. And I have to tell you, as I continue to work with Sanja, I appreciate the deep dive she takes around language. So I'm sure that will potentially come up. And then educational attainment. And so what is social class identity? Wanted to offer you those. Sandra or Tanya, anything that you would add or want to touch on?
I think this is brilliant, Becky, and you named so many, and you all have named so many of the markers that we read that we use in thinking about our own and the others' social class, and they're markers, and that's what I thought you were going to say around the conscious piece was that we are constantly reading class unconsciously because of these things.
Yes, yeah, I appreciate that, right? Because I will say we never talk about class and we always talk about class.
And I agree. I think the other thing with this, Becky, too, is that we can look about this in our own lives, like in our daily living spaces and our grocery stores and, all of those things as well. But also, how is this showing up on our campuses and how are we recreating it on our campuses as we think about different levels of staffing, as we think about how we talk about different student populations or what the assumptions we make people have in terms of access to things. One of the things for me around grocery shopping is when I go to my parents' house, there's a Piggly Wiggly about 3 miles from my parents' house. And there are literally 4 options of yogurt. If you go to my grocery store here in North Carolina, I'm still in a small town, but closer to Charlotte, which is a bigger metroplex, different sort of social class makeup. There's a whole long wall full of yogurts. And so even things like that about access to food and food deserts and choices and all of those things too.
Right. And as you talk about food, right, now that I've gotten older and I'm learning a little bit more, I know that I shop more the outside parameter of the store. Right. I don't necessarily shop in the middle of the store as much anymore. And that has shifted in my own income as well as knowledge around health and food. So appreciate that bringing that up. So now we're going to introduce a little bit about social class identity and the different forms, right? And so Abby, the next slide, yeah, that one. So one of the things we think about is where we can get stuck or where we have ourselves in regards to social class. And if you haven't already been able to tell, I think Sanja and I and Tanya, we're in a fluid space around social class. And so there is the class of origin, and that is how you grew up, who you grew up around, what you had, what you didn't have, right? That is the childhood piece of our social class identity, and that's one component. And then there is the current or the felt class. And so really, as I think I'm middle class plus, right? Middle class, probably from a financial space, probably middle upper, and then upper other pieces of those capital. And that's what we feel, that's what we know, that's how we navigate the world. And then there's attributed and what's put on us. And so, so what do people think about me driving this particular car or doing travel, or that I'm Dr. Martinez? Like, what does that mean? I mean, oftentimes it is, especially working in higher ed. If you work in higher, that means that you come from a middle class family, and that's such a myth because that's an attribute that people make. That's an assumption that people make, right? Even it can be attributed to like what we eat, right? Where we go, how we talk, and so what's put on us. And what I appreciate about these different pieces is they don't work in silos. They're very connected as we think about social class identity. So sometimes, as I heard Sanja say, sometimes for me that there's tension in those values. And so, in my working class space, I'm supposed to be direct. We don't get feelings hurt. You just say it as it is. We don't have a lot of time to walk around issues. And in higher ed, right, it is, let's be strategic and intentional and have committees. And sometimes I'm like, what in the hell are we doing? And so these exist in the same body, right? And in the same bodies in your office, how you engage students, right? How you think about budget, how you think about taking time and rest. And so it's just not one entry point for what social class identity is, but it is these multiple pieces.
So we have a question.
Sure.
How do we balance the conversation around using and analyzing one's privilege versus one's capital? So it's a powerful question.
Can you read that again?
Sure.
How do you balance?
How do we balance the conversation around using and analyzing, quote, one's privilege versus one's capital, end quote?
Well, so I'm curious for the question. I would love to be able to take the person off of mute, but we can't do that. To kind of ask the reason, right? And so like privilege and capital, I don't have them not existing separately,
Yep.
right? Like they are connected.
Yep.
And so then how do we approach with humility? How do we approach with self-awareness? How do we recognize, our privilege in the capital, right? Or where there's dissonance or tension among those. So I don't have it being an either or. I have it being able to hold both.
I would agree with that, Becky. And I think too is having us think about that oftentimes we privilege certain capitals. So as we think about higher education, or we think about engaging students like in different leadership programs, we privilege certain forms of capital, particularly in higher ed, where we might say, oh, we really value, I'm going to give you some like a basic example. We really value being on the debate team or on this, but not necessarily you caregiving for your younger siblings. Well, you may have learned the same skills from both of those spaces, but why are we treating them differently? And so I think that's the other piece to it too, is how do we recognize which capitals we are granting privilege to and which ones we're not.
Right. So again, right, which ones we value, and not just we value, but like which ones do, if we think about privilege or dominance, right, in systems, like what's valued from the systems level. And, where is in our office spaces, does that connect? Or where is there, again, tension? Or where is there like, I'm not doing that. Right? And how that plays itself out. And we know that, there's relationships, there's needing to navigate. I mean, there's all of those pieces that exist in that. So I appreciate that question. And we know that we could probably spend so much more time just on talking about that. And we want to recognize, as Tanya says, I want to keep you on time, right? To explore some more concepts. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to give some theoretical pieces of social class, or at least what we're finding out there in connection to our own work.
Yeah. So for those of you who are like, how do I ground some of this work in theory, or maybe what theories can we use to sort of analyze, deconstruct, reconstruct our leadership learning programs on our campuses or even within our offices? Tara Yassa's community cultural wealth model is actually a critical race theory model. It wasn't created for social class, so I want to honor that and own that. And a lot of folks who study and practice and talk about social class have used this to sort of give examples of other forms of social class in addition to the original ones, and some of those that Dr. Martinez was talking about are embedded here, right? So we see the cultural capital pieces and the social capital pieces, but this model really sort of extends that and has us think about other forms of capital and how do we view things from an asset-based perspective versus a deficit-based perspective. So as we think about social class, we may say, well, students who are poor working class or employees who are in different class strata are lacking these things. And actually, they're probably lacking nothing. They probably bring a ton of depth and skill sets and knowledge and experience and wisdom. Again, we just don't always value those forms of capital. And so how do we understand that those perspectives actually add a lot of value and that leadership can be practiced from those perspectives and are all over the country and all over the world. And so I'm not going to go through all of these different components, but I think it is important because it also extends the conversation outside of just money, income, and wealth, which you do see present in this model, but also the other forms as well. Particularly, I think in reference to leadership, things like navigational capital and resistant capital and aspirational capital are important. And if students are showing up on our campuses, they've already said to us they have aspirational capital, because if a student from a poor and working class background ends up at our institutions, they've had to bust tail to do that. And so thinking about how do we harbor that skill they already have and help them further those sorts of skills. Same thing with resistant capital, especially as we see leadership in forms of activism, is saying this system is not set up for me because of my social class, race, ethnicity, sexuality, et cetera. And so those students are already pushing against the system. And so how do we harbor that again and help them extend that as a form of leadership? Because it is. And then the navigational capital, I think with leadership is interesting as well, because there are so many systems, particularly in higher ed. We love an org chart, we love a policy, and some of those things are helpful. And some of those things constrain our ability to engage in change and equity. So the model just gives us different ways for thinking about the assets people bring to the perspective, but also different ways we can practice leadership as well. And then the second model we just want to highlight briefly, if I can have the next slide, Abby, is William Liu's social class worldview model. And this is actually just a small part of the broader model. And there's actually two versions of this. So if you want to go down the rabbit hole on theory here, Liu has the 2004 model, which he did with some colleagues, which this is part of the original model. And there's also a revised version of the model from 2011 that sort of extends this and adds more environmental factors into the sort of dynamic and evaluation and analysis process. But essentially, we like to show this model and sort of the snapshot of it as the different components that make up our social class worldview. And so really centering the consciousness, attitudes, and saliency. So how aware am I of my social class? And so to Becky's point earlier about consciousness, like how conscious am I about it, or how many things are just in sort of my subconscious, or I understand it in sort of unconscious or feel in unconscious ways. How do I feel about my social class? And then thinking about it in relation to all the other identities I hold, how important is it to me, right? Is it sort of top 3? Is it bottom 2? And sort of what does that mean? And often the less conscious we are, the less feelings we have about it, the less salient it is for us. And so how do we start to do some work there to explore those parts that Becky talked about earlier about your current felt class, your attributed class, and your class of origin. The bottom sort of 3 circles there around lifestyle, property, relationships, and behaviors sort of ties back to forms of capital, but lifestyle is about how we spend our time. Do we work 3 jobs? Do students have caretaking responsibilities? What does it mean if I am doing my leadership in community-based spaces versus campus-based spaces? So all those sorts of pieces. Relationships to property is about owning stuff and sort of the materialist sort of part. Do we assume students own technology, especially right now? Do we assume they have access to broadband internet? Do we make assumptions that they have a blazer to wear to interview for a leadership program? All of those sorts of pieces, and how other people view those. So I always tell the story. I drive my 2009 Toyota Corolla, proud of it. The paint's peeling off of it. And I still have, I bought it purposely to have roll up, like manual. Some of you may have never seen those manual windows and manual locks. And people will get into my car and make fun of me and be like, what are you doing? And I'm like, that shit never breaks. It will never break. And it doesn't. I've had other issues with my car. I've never had issues with the locks and windows. And so our relationships to property, and what does that mean? But now, I'm okay with spending money on a plane ticket, but I'm not okay with paying $2,000 extra to have electric locks and windows. And so that goes sort of back to my lifestyle and behaviors. But behaviors is about how we talk, how we eat, how we dress, all of those things about how we present ourselves to the world and what does that mean. It's why people will say I have a thicker accent when I'm talking to somebody from my hometown, or I've had 3 beers, right? And why I have a more academic accent if I'm in academic spaces. And so what does that code switching around language from linguistics and those sorts of things mean? And then the top 3 circles are really about referent groups. Who do we compare ourselves to? And I think that can be really important in the higher ed space when we're working with students, but also colleagues, but students particularly, because we assume that they're sort of all on the same level in terms of social class. And that's not true. And there also has been, we've seen some change in this, I think, over the past few years, but this assumption that, oh, we're all poor college students. False. That is not a reality. We have students who are food insecure, housing insecure, who are utilizing government assistance programs. And we have other students who say, I just haven't got the deposit from my parents yet this week. And so those are very different things. And so how do we understand true things around basic needs, but also that if students have random roommates they're moving into the residence hall with, then they may be the first time they're trying to have a relationship across social class. And what does that mean when student A has like Target exploded over their side of the room and student B comes with a duffel bag with the things that are what they actually need to be able to have toothpaste and those sorts of things, the basic needs sorts of components there, and they're having to live together and sort of make meaning of that and challenge with that. And that also happens in our leadership spaces. That it might be a residence hall in a leadership living learning community. And so how are you talking about that and managing that in these processes? So much broader model also talks about different forms of classism and things like that, but wanted to give you a snippet of that today as some theoretical grounding to sort of understand this broad way that social class impacts how we are in the world in combination with the other identities that we hold. Becky, Tanya adds to that.
This is really powerful. And I'm watching the clock and want to get to y'all's next polling question. So I'm going to invite that in.
Great, thank you. So as we think about sort of this broader understanding of what social class is, the question is, how comfortable are you to talk about these things to your family members, to your colleagues, to the students and the programs that you may facilitate or advise on your campus? So if you can take a minute and respond to this question, how comfortable are you engaging social class? So is this brand new to you? And that's completely okay if it is. Is it something that is more top of the mind for you and you've done some more exploration on? Are there certain spaces where you're willing to engage this, but not other spaces? So we'll give you a couple more seconds to respond to that.
So I'm loving what's coming in, and I'll give you the preview that we have a lot of people here who are more comfortable talking about class. And it is often, we talk about people who attend things sort of as the choir. But what I know is, as a choir member who I love to talk about class, I am always learning and extending and exploring. And so I think this is great.
Yeah, and we're seeing that on the poll here. So thank you for that awareness of what's in the chat box there, Tanya. But it seems like a lot of our people are very comfortable, which is amazing. Please go help your colleagues around campuses, because I don't think that's always true. Or, our families. I have it's a challenge sometimes to have those conversations as we talk across class or as we straddle between them as well. Becky, I'll kick it back to you.
Wonderful. As I was hearing that, I think it's great because we're seeing this wave of folks that are wanting to engage in social class and are comfortable. And one of the things that I reflect on is, am I comfortable talking about it from a theoretical space? Or am I talking about it, so maybe not or, and I'm able to talk about it from how it affects my soul, right? And so, do I talk about the fact that I don't have to pay attention to how much I'm calculating to the cent when I go to the grocery store, right? Or that, like, how am I talking about class in a pandemic right now? Because if that's not mentioned in this, I'm not quite sure, right? Around who can, like, who's essential, right? And can I really talk about that? How do I feel? Do I feel guilty? Do I feel stuck? Don't I realize it? Do I know how to engage it? And so I could talk about class in my early 30s from a framework of theory and stuff that I've read. I didn't get into like the in-depth soul pain work until years later. Right. And so even as we develop those questions, it's like, okay, so, how do we approach being engaged in this? And so with that, we have some reflective questions as you think about what's your own class story. Sanja and I wrote a little book, co-authored a little book with some amazing voices in it around their own class story in regards to straddling. And so we've offered these reflective questions, right? We would ask you to, one, we know you're going to get this recording, but, write some stuff down, even as we're in this space of increasing our consciousness, right? And so when's the first time that you recall knowing your social class in all of the ways that it exists? And so, going back to those, oh, I remember when, or I asked this question, or I didn't know. How would you define your class of origin, your current or your felt class, or your attributed class? I always appreciate the story of the car. And I'm like, Sanja and I have talked several times about this. Like, I sure hope they sell one of those cars when you go to buy a car again. And we don't know, right? And what all of that means. And so class of origin, current, felt, attributed. And then what are the challenges of engaging social class and leadership practice? So whether you are in a formal role or not, right? How do you experience, what do you notice, and what are challenges to engage it? And so as we heard around, what is our office doing? What is valued? What is talked about? Programmatically, what does our even leadership program look like? What are challenges that you come across? And then what might help you engage social class in leadership practice? So we're offering you these questions for reflection and for sharing in the chat, because we know that this is a community space. It's just not 3 people across the screen. And I'm inviting Tanya or Sanja to answer any one of those that you would like to share with the group.
I appreciate these questions, and I know y'all might not be able to be looking at the chat, but people are coming in with part of their class story, which is so beautiful to me. I think about how would I define my class of origin, race working class, and like really feel connected to that. And currently, like you, Becky, I use the language of straddler because some of my felt class, because I know, class, any identity is also psychological, and how we've internalized that. Some of my felt class is very much still working class experience, and the felt experience of it is middle, upper middle, as a single person with degrees and a consultant. The fact that I could move into consultancy tells me that there is some class privilege there. And then attributed, this is where I'm like, oh, intersections, because I don't ascribe to professionalism. And so I wear whatever the hell I want to work. And because of my race, and sometimes because of, what I have on, people attribute my class very differently until I open my mouth.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I mean, even so, for folks to know that, as Sanja, Tanya, as we were prepping for this session and even thinking about how do we title ourselves or what do we put out there, um, it had said, so Sanja and I had doctor and Tanya didn't. And so, we emailed and said, hey, and Tanya's like, that's not something that I use very often. And so, even in this space of titles, and I don't often, but I want to make sure people know. Right. And that's race, class, and gender in the intersection for me. Right? And so it's those little pieces that aren't so little of how they exist in us and how people put stuff on us or don't. So that attributed piece. And then when I go to family reunions, I have a cousin who always introduces me as doctor. This is Dr. Martinez. This is Dr. Martinez. And I was like, can you stop doing that? Right. And he's like, but I'm so proud. And it's this like, I think that that's awesome. And that creates a distance between me and other people and the family that don't know me as well. Right. And that for me is very clear of how class exists in my body and exists in my interactions with people. Sanja, anything?
Yeah, I'll say too that for that third question there, that I think are challenges of engaging social class in leadership practice, but I think in higher ed more broadly as well, and I've mentioned this to you before, Becky, is that sometimes people don't want to actually say the words that are associated with social class. And so using words like poor or working class in conversation and writing get some really interesting reactions from people in terms of you can't say that, or it's uncouth, or if you had any understanding of people's experiences, you wouldn't use those words, which I think is really interesting. And I've gotten feedback about that in writing submissions or conference presentation proposals and things like that. And so we've been really purposeful, I think, in our writing to use that language. But I think it's scary language for people, which I think is interesting because I grew up with those words. That's the words we use to describe ourselves in our communities. And I was reading some in the chat box, and I appreciate Joy's comment about, thinking that where you're growing up, sometimes it's only people who are poor and people who are rich, and there's really no in between, and there may not actually be in some spaces based on how things are stratified. And so I think even getting people to sometimes say the words, particularly sometimes for most people who do grow up in stratified communities by race and class, and then having them engage in a higher ed space where there may be people across those identities, and then being afraid to step in it. Like, I can't say the word poor. Oh, I can't say the word Black. And so then we can't actually have quality, I don't think, conversations or move towards equity if we can't even say the words.
Yeah.
So I'm watching time, but there's a question here that I want to get in. Does language like quote, class of origin obscure the impact of the systemic nature of class oppression, which is always intersectional?
So what has been important is to recognize the intersection and to be able to pull the thread. Yeah. So that we can be more clear on how it shows up, right? Because intersections is critical. Because I don't enter a room, like we don't enter spaces in just single identity people. And I think about how do I show up, right? Like I can be more clear on how I show up in class because I've done so much work around that. So how does race, class, and gender show up in me? But if I, because sometimes it could be, there could be a lot of, I could default to, right? And not see how sometimes I show up as elitist, classist asshole, right? In my demand around customer service or in the language that I use around accessibility and knowing of words and terms. And sometimes I do that on purpose because I'm triggered in other spaces, but that's not how I want to show up. Right. And so if we can pull those threads and have them be threaded together. And I know that there's a lot around class of origin, like what does that mean? And, how does that play itself out? And how, like, what do I value and not that may be the same or maybe different? It's complex. Yeah.
Okay, I want to make sure we get that last polling question in.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's me. That is me because I'm reading the chat. I'm like, dang, we could do like more hours, and we don't have that time. So what do you believe is the primary barrier students experience engaging with leadership opportunities? And so as you think about, who's showing up and who's not showing up, who's part of what and who's not, what are some, what's a barrier or a primary barrier that people and students aren't engaging, whether that be time, right, cost, right, caregiver status, and that is defined in so many different ways, job conflict, right, seeing themselves within leadership and believing that they have leadership skills. And so we want you just to spend some time answering this from a, what do you notice, right, in your own work or around your campus or in higher ed? And if we have folks that aren't in higher ed, right, how do you still notice, right? Because leadership, right, across different industries can have some similar traits.
While we wait for some of these to come in, and obviously, I think we look at cost, and are there specific like highlights around how classism is playing into each of these?
Oh my goodness.
I'm sorry, I came with the big question.
I'm like, dang, Tanya didn't prepare us for that question. And Sanja, please come in too, so that it's not my only voice, right? All of them, right? I mean, like they're so deeply entrenched in all of them. And so, so even time, right? There's a value around time, which can be linked to class. Right? How do we spend our time? What does that mean? Um, you know, what time should be spent? Like there's a lot of shoulding around class and time. Cost is pretty, like, okay, we know that. Right? Caregiver status, whether it is a parent or a child or a nephew, and then who can give care, right? And what does that look like in balancing or juggling all of the stuff that we may not be balancing? And I think that there's, then we can get deep into it, right? Around, and so what can caregiver status also be for me giving myself care? Shit, that's a whole other conversation. Right? And what that means, right? Whether we have different jobs, right? Whether there's an assistantship or whether there is, it is through financial assistance or aid that students are working into. So job conflicts. And then, as we think about leadership, what is a leader? What does that mean? Sanja has a book. I don't know, is it called a book or a journal, New Directions? I'm not quite sure.
Monograph? I don't know.
Right?
New Directions for Student Leadership. How about that?
There we go. Right. And so that's what it's dug into.
Yep.
Right. Yep.
And I would say too, and I appreciate Tracy's point in the chat box, which still there. Okay, I see it now. About the part where we see the most percentage here around seeing themselves in terms of leadership identity, and that this could look different at different higher ed institutions. And so thank you, Tracy, for putting that point about, does it look different in historically white institutions compared to historically Black institutions or community colleges or tribal colleges or women's colleges? And so that may be very different. And I still wonder if the social class piece still enters there, because they may share a gender identity or a racial identity with the majority of students on campus and may see leadership reflected in that component of it, but do they also see it reflected in the social class component of it? So I do think it would be interesting to sort of dig into that and to have people around similar institutional types talk about how does social class show up in those particular spaces that are identity conscious or identity centered already on one component of identity, but is it carrying across the intersections of identity as well? Because I believed my grandfather, my papa, was like the best leader ever. He was engaged in the community. He was civically active. He did good at his work. He also volunteered. He, played cards with his friends. And so, but that didn't translate when I got to my undergraduate institution to how I perceived at least leadership was defined.
I also hear in that, and this, whenever we have these conversations, I keep going back to, man, this is so layered, that just what you're saying, that, and I think Rob got it in the chat as well, that because we have leadership defined in a particular way, you know, people don't see the, custodian and the cafeteria person as leaders. When very much, I watched people on every campus that I've ever worked on take students in, help them assist, and, show leadership practices, that the things that I consider leadership practices, in ways where their jobs didn't have students name them as leaders because they weren't the president of the institution. But what was true was the president of the institution, not a leader at all. And so, like, really getting that layered piece in there and connected, and this might be a nice little setup. Wow, my Oprah skills are coming out. The way that you all in your book, I think in some ways encourage professionals on campuses to be more transparent and visible, having a variety of class backgrounds, I think is beautiful to me through those stories. And so students might not see the leaders because the leaders might be hiding behind their current class or their felt class, or hiding behind the internalized classism that they have experienced. And so I'm going to invite y'all to respond to that, and we're going to get to talk a little bit about your book and a resource.
You want to go, Santa?
Yeah, sure. We want to offer these as sort of guiding questions to go back to your spaces, workspaces, home spaces, any space that you find yourself in, to sort of engage in conversation or analysis or those sorts of things. And so considering you might be really good at talking about social class, but is that true of your colleagues in your office or your departments or wherever you're sort of situated? If you're a single consultant person, have you done that introspective work? And if you don't, why? What's that about? We also want you to think about how and what ways do you engage social class barriers? And so are you recognizing what those barriers are? Because often it's not the students that are lacking something, it's us who have constructed a barrier that doesn't let them access the thing for a whole host of reasons. And so have we done that analysis of the barriers that we've constructed that may limit students' ability to engage or desire to engage as well? And then how might leadership learning on your campus be preferencing certain social class values or behaviors? So as I mentioned earlier, sometimes we give privilege and we bestow privilege on certain forms of capital. And so is that happening in your spaces? And if so, how do we perhaps undo and redo some of that or create a different system that allows for more equity across class, but also across other dimensions of identity as well? So that's some food for thought.
Food for thought.
So in May 2019, you all published, or you wrote a book and published a book that I really, people have been asking for other resources. I highly recommend this one, but if you all want to share a little bit more about that.
Oh, it was one of our loves, I think, because what we had noticed is people weren't talking about social class. And Sanja and I were doing we were doing conferences. Right? We were presenting social class at conferences, the two of us, or there was a cadre of us that were working together in some pre-cons. And we had said, like it would be lovely to have our stories in the academy talked about so that we can expand this space around social class. And so we have these chapters from various folks in the institution, from undergrad to people that were in higher ed that aren't in higher ed anymore, and the layers in between. And so really this storytelling space. And we have some content around class that gives some definitions, right, gives some theory. We know that there's not a social class identity development model out there yet. And want to offer this as a piece of that. And what we appreciated, it's so much more than us. And it one of the things that I think impacts me is, I got to take the deep breath of sometimes the tenured faculty stories 40 to 50 years later are the same as the undergrad stories. Right? And how much work we have to do in the academy around social class. And one of the themes that came out, not a recommendation, the themes that came out is, let's just start talking about it. right? Engage in it and wrestle in it and be messy in it and have that be okay. But we don't, right? And so how do we just start talking about it so that we can, create the waves of how then social class is engaged, identified, expanded in higher education.
And I'll offer too, and Dr. Martinez and I have other publications together too, from different frames. One is more in the like student affairs, sort of professionalism space that's in Reese Tran et al.'s book on debunking the myth of job fit in student affairs. But there are other folks who are studying social class too. And so I want to honor some of that as well. So Dr. Krista Soria at the University of Minnesota has done a variety of work, qualitative and quantitative, on social class and how it shows up on campuses from access to success. Dr. David J. Nguyen, who's at Ohio University, has done more work about social class in the graduate student space, if that is of interest to you. Dr. Brittany Williams, who's at St. Cloud State University, has done some work around social class, particularly, I believe, around Black women and social class. And Dr. Georgiana Martin at the University of Georgia as well has some of this work. And there are new folks who are coming up. Ty McNamee, who is a doctoral student at Teachers College, is doing some of his dissertation work around this. So I think we're going to start to see additional scholars, resources, scholar practitioners who are chatting about social class and how it shows up, particularly in higher education. Also great resources in sociology and psychology as well. I will mention Dr. Georgiana Martin and I have an edited book coming out in May. So if you're like, what do we do about this? That edited book is all people who are on campuses who said, here's what we're doing and here's why it's working for us, or here's what we're trying and we're not sure if it's going to work. And so if you want some scalable examples, that may be helpful to you. And then Dr. Williams and Dr. Martinez wrote a chapter for the New Directions for Student Leadership issue that's coming out in March around social class and leadership learning that I got to edit with Dr. Kathy Guthrie at Florida State. So there is emerging scholarship coming out about this, if that is of interest to you, just as an FYI.
Yeah.
And I will say, just a plug, because it's an organization that Becky and I are involved in. If you are interested in like diving into classism and doing some of that work, we get to work with an organization called Class Action. And they are at www.classism.org. Lots of great resources there as well. Someone asked earlier about resources and going in deep. You know, you have a nice long list of resources. I just want to say thank you to both of you. Like, we really, 5 hours, we could do a whole like week-long series just on class and digging in. But thanks for giving your time. And I want to say thank you to all the folks who have arrived. And the last thing I want to offer is LeaderShape has a lot of programs. If you're not familiar with LeaderShape, we have really expanded our online offerings during the pandemic. We, of course, have our in-person programs of Catalyst and the Institute, but Resilience is available, Courageous Dialogue is available, and you can find out all of that great information at leadershape.org. And we would love to talk about how these programs might benefit your campus and share a little bit more about how you can participate. Again, thank you. This has been fantastic. Thank you for the really awesome and active chat. Such a beautiful sharing and community. And thank you for attending our virtual sessions. We wish you a wonderful rest of your day and wonderful weekend.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank y'all
Take care. Have a great weekend.